Christian Family Solutions. We're a mental health counseling organization, and I kind of joke that we have gone through an identity disorder. We used to be called, I guess we still kind of are, Wisconsin Lutheran Child and Family Services, WLCFS. Some of you may have heard of that before. And then we were Christian Family Counseling, and now we're Christian Family Solutions. But we are the same organization through and through who are really focused on keeping Christ at the center of all that we do. I work out of the Appleton office. We have 80 different clinics all around the whole country, okay? And so we are in schools. We are in Wisconsin. We have clinics pretty much all throughout the country. But I am actually from the Appleton area. I graduated from Fox Valley Lutheran High School. I won't even tell you when. It was a while ago. And then I went on to actually college up here in Green Bay at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, and then went on and did my graduate school at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And then after I did that, to be a psychologist, you have to do a residency. So I did my residency in the Twin Cities at the medical school there, and also at the VA hospital there for serving veterans. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to do a rotation on a place that's called the Mood Disorders Unit, which is really helping people with anxiety and depression. And so that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about this morning, is understanding depression and anxiety. Now, I understand you guys had Karen Fisher here. You had Stacy Nagorski here. Hopefully they did wonderfully. I love them both. They're great. It's kind of a little pressure when you have to follow up such some great presentations, so hopefully I don't disappoint. But I'm trying to build off of what they really talked. I don't want to try to repeat a whole lot of what they did, but I know they haven't talked quite as much about depression, and so I was going to focus a little bit more on the depression side of things today, but also then talk a lot about different tools and techniques and strategies that I use when I'm working with people who might be struggling with depression or anxiety, and give you guys some of the tools and the resources. And if you feel like you still need some help, or that there are some others in your life who may need additional help, that you know some resources that would be available for their assistance. There are a few handouts in the back. One of them kind of loosely follows along with the slides. That's just so you guys don't have to feel like you have to copy everything down. It also has my contact information on there, that should any of you have questions or need any more information, I'm really here to be a resource, and so please do not hesitate to give me a call, send me an email, just to normalize that. Most of the time when I do presentations, I usually get 3 to 5 emails from people afterwards, so don't hesitate to think, I don't want to be the only one who sends him an email. I tend to get a few, so please don't be a stranger and help out. So as I mentioned, understanding depression and anxiety. See, I think my clicker might be a little bit, we're doing okay. Here's the roadmap for our time this morning. First of all, just giving you a little overview of kind of what is depression, how common is depression, and also what might it look like, and talking about what are some of the causes of depression. Okay? I think it's just wonderful that your church has invited us to be here, because I think mental illness and mental health concerns historically has been a little bit of a taboo topic in the church. And one of my personal missions as a psychologist is to really help destigmatize mental health problems, especially in the church. We will see, as we're going through some of the topics in the slides today, that there really aren't any differences in terms of the frequency of how often people have depression, if they're Christians or non-Christians. Mental health problems, just like physical health problems, it doesn't discriminate if you have faith or you don't have faith. It affects all of us. It is truly a part of the sinful condition. And we'll talk about some of the reasons for that. Now, one of the blessings is that we know having faith and our religious beliefs can really be a huge source of strength in helping people overcome depression and anxiety. So it can really be an asset there. So we'll talk about what is depression, and then I would like to spend a lot of our time today trying to talk about what to do about it. Just so that, again, I know like Stacy and Karen both talked about different tools and techniques, but to give you guys some real practical guidance on what to do should you be struggling with either anxiety or depression. having a hard time reaching the... We have to get a little bit closer here. Or you can just click it to the next one. Yeah, just click it forward. Not working here. There we go. So I always start off presentations, as I think we should, but talking about what does God say about this. And these I know are some passages that may have been discussed in the previous presentations, but I think are very relevant to our conversation on mental health concerns like anxiety and depression. Number one, it really emphasizes in John chapter 16, don't be surprised, okay, that we know, God tells us, you're going to have trouble. And the beautiful part of it is that we can also take heart because we know that in the end, Jesus already has overcome for us. But I say this largely just because I don't want people to get so freaked out if they do struggle with anxiety or depression and think that almost automatically, it must mean I have a faith problem, or it must mean that I'm not trusting God enough. Now, that can be a factor, don't get me wrong, but that is not necessarily the primary reason why you might be struggling. And I say this just as a bit of word of comfort and reassurance here. From Philippians, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. There are so many passages in Scripture that talk about worry, that talk about anxiety. I don't want to play God and say I can think like God, but I think there's a reason for that, in that He knows that this is going to be one of the struggles that humans do battle. Okay, there's one of my favorite books out there. It just goes to show you I'm a little bit of a nerd. It's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Has anybody read the book? It's an interesting book written by a Stanford neuroscientist, and talks about just how we have this amazing mind and this amazing brain. And no other kind of creature on this earth has such brain power. We have the ability to think abstractly. But sometimes that ability to think about the future and to think about hypothetical things can really run amok. And that's when we start to worry, okay? Because there's virtually no other being on this earth that worries. They may have fear, which is in response to an immediate danger, but only humans can really worry because we're the only ones that God gave that amazing brain power and that brain capacity to. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's referenced so often in Scripture. Don't be surprised if you do have worry and anxiety. And then finally from Romans, and we know that in all things, God works good, works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. I always use this passage very sparingly and I think very cautiously when I'm meeting with people, because I don't want people to think that I'm saying to them, I'm so glad that you're depressed because, God promises to work good in your life because of your depression. Most of the time, people are going to be fairly insulted if I say that to them, especially if it's not done carefully and respectfully. But I think this is a really important point for us all to really meditate on, is that no matter what we have gone through, I have clients right now who are in the middle of escaping domestic violence marriages. I have many clients I'm meeting with right now who have histories of all kinds of abuse and assault histories. And I have actually seen, and there's actually really good research to show this, that God does work good in many of those people's lives, of how they can actually go on to advocate for other people who may be in a similar situation, or how they can be a one to open up a conversation with another believer because they themselves have struggled with it and they have that street credibility. And so they may actually be that light, that little beam of hope to actually say, I've been there. And so it's an important reminder that God does promise that in all things, He will use it for our own good. A couple of just general mental health facts. I don't know that they've referenced these, but I think the point with this slide, about 1 in 5 adults in America experiences a mental illness. That's a lot of people, isn't it? That's 20% of people at one point in their life will have a diagnosed mental health concern. Now, why do I say this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, just to normalize this, that this is fairly common. And I think part of the reason why we don't often appreciate this is just from the standpoint that it hasn't been talked about a whole lot. Okay? When I first got accepted into graduate school to be a psychologist, I was quite excited. It was a fairly competitive process, kind of like medical school. And so when I got accepted, I was telling everybody. And I was so excited to tell my paternal grandmother, my dad's mom. And you know what she said to me? Brandon, do you really think people are going to come talk to you? Now, I can tell you right now at our clinic in Appleton, we have 8 full-time clinicians. We are pretty much booked out almost through the end of the year in terms of appointments availability. People are coming and talking to us because this is a real big problem. I think there are some generational kind of mindsets that sometimes if we don't talk about it, then it really isn't there. But the reality is this is out there in our community. And it's at probably a higher rate than we would like to see, certainly. But again, if you look at that's almost 44 million people out there who are struggling in a given year. That's a lot of hurting souls out there, isn't it? And what a beautiful opportunity that we have as Christians to not only help them, but also then share the good news of Jesus, who, again, really be able to keep things in that heavenly perspective. Okay. A couple of other statistics here. Nearly 60% of adults who actually have a mental illness didn't receive mental health services in the past year. Okay? So what that's telling us, kind of building off the previous slide, there's a lot of people out there who are hurting, and a lot of those hurting people are not getting the help that they need. Okay? What do you think are some of the reasons of why so few people tend to actually get the help that they actually need? Very good. So for those of you who maybe didn't hear that this has just become their normal, okay? I have been depressed for so long that this is just sort of what I have come to accept as kind of the usual for me, right? And I think building off of that, sometimes when you do struggle with it for weeks, for months, for years, you get a little hopeless, right? This is just how it's been for how long? Is there really any light at the end of the tunnel? Can it really be better than this? This has just been my whole life, okay? Yes, please.
I think society has attached a stigma to the term mental health issue.
Yes.
That you're a mental case.
Yep. That, unfortunately, I think it's getting better. It is certainly not gone, but there continues to be a stigma. And we do tend to have kind of this prototype in our mind of a crazy person if you have mental illness when it is not, okay? It's like 75% or 80% of all people with depression are still working, right? It's not as if you're living under a bridge and you're rocking or something like that. No, there are severe mental or severe situations, but there continues to be a very negative, very judgmental stigma about it. Okay? Yeah. Cost, right? As much as we are trying to, have universal health care for all, even if you have universal health care, sometimes the cost is still pretty extraordinary, isn't it? Okay? That's just the reality. Yeah?
They're unable to get the help. Somebody knows they need it. They can't do it themselves, but you're not allowed to get it for them either.
Absolutely. We see this a lot with kids, right? Where kids are really struggling in schools, and they rely on mom, dad, grandma, caretaker, guardian to get them there. And they just cannot be depended upon to do that.
Even as an adult, a young adult.
Absolutely.
You can't do anything.
Nope. If they're 18 years old, they're an adult, you can't really push them or force them to do much of anything, can you?
Or even make an appointment for them.
You can't even make the appointment for them. Yep. Any other kind of barriers? Yes, please.
I don't have time.
I don't have time, right?
Don't have time to do it.
That's just kind of the way of our society nowadays. We are very, very busy, right? I often think of our society as being fairly frenetic right now. We're just always on the go, and that's almost become such our norm that if we're not busy, it almost feels like something's wrong. And so we've really kind of flipped that around. Yeah, one more.
I think also people may think, I'm thinking of a particular do anything different. He's not that bad, yet there's hundreds and hundreds of medications that could help him, but he's tried them all and they just don't work.
Yeah. And sometimes
He has this attitude that nothing's going to work.
nothing's going to work. Yeah.
Don't bother.
And to be fair, we know that with medications, especially mental health medications, part of it is actually having some openness or willingness to believe that this can help me. Okay? Sometimes call that the placebo effect, but it actually is a factor when it comes to some psychiatric medications. Okay? One of the other troubling things here, too, is that 50% of youth age 8 to 15 did not receive the mental health services that they need. Okay? And this is just maybe a Captain Obvious point. With any kind of condition, whether it's a medical condition, whether it's a mental health condition, the earlier that we can get people help, the better the outcome and the better the prognosis is, right? I mean, that just kind of makes sense. The sooner that we can kind of begin dealing with this, the better it's going to be. And this is concerning to me as I'll show you on a couple of slides here. 50% of all of the lifetime cases of mental health begin by age 14, and 75% begin before the age 24. So what is this telling us? That a lot of these struggles that people have, even as adults, when are they starting? They're starting early. Now, we'll just throw it out there. What do you think are some of the reasons why the period of adolescence is usually this peak time when we start to see a lot of these concerns becoming more problematic or more of an actual real issue? Yeah.
Well, you're becoming more cognizant and you're bringing on more responsibilities. So you're not only taking on the responsibility, but you understand the consequences.
Absolutely. So there's a lot, I mean, life just gets a lot more serious when you are an adolescent, isn't it? Okay? What are some other reasons? Yeah. Hormones, right? With physical development, we know that that is just a real deal, okay? I do a presentation, it's called The Teenage Brain. What's going on in there, okay? And we talk a lot about how hormone levels, and even we call them neurotransmitter, chemicals in the brain, that those levels begin to drastically change. And that's one of the reasons we start to see, these really kind of infatuous relationships with, partners, or we start to see these flashes of anger and violence at levels that maybe we don't see even younger with temper tantrums, okay? Some of that is just physical development. It's natural, it's normal. But you couple these physical changes with a lot of these life changes when life becomes a lot more serious and there are consequences that can certainly stick around and affect your life for a lot longer into the future. We start to see that pressure really begin to weigh on people, and these issues become a lot more of a kind of a concern, okay? Oh, one more here. The average delay. So we know that for some of the reasons we even talked about, people don't tend to get the help right away, okay? I can't even tell you the number of times I have talked to people, and they have said, you're the first person I've ever told. And these people might be in their 30s, 40s, 60s, 70s. And again, I'm not saying there's one reason for that, but there's a huge problem that we have here, that people who really need the help, for many reasons, are just not seeking out that help, okay? And again, part of one of my big missions when I go out and I speak to people is, let's try to destigmatize this as best as we can, because we know that this is out there. We know that this is fairly common. It's just as common in the church as it is without. This is the result of living in a sinful world with imperfect bodies and imperfect minds. Just like sometimes babies have cancer and people have high blood pressure, this is a problem. And the only thing that we can really do is try to help people who deal with these things, okay? We also know that the impact is pretty significant. The number one reason that we see by the World Health Organization, the number one reason from the Social Security Disability Office of why are people unable to work, it's depression. Okay? Now, there are lots of reasons for that. Again, we'll talk about some of the factors that may contribute. But the bottom line is, this is a lot more common than we probably like to admit. And for those people who do struggle with it, it can be devastating. Okay? So we're going to do a little Depression 101 here. I know it might be a little bit small up there, so I will try to maybe summarize as best I can. I think the church secretary also will be getting a copy of these slides, so if you guys would like a copy, maybe she will disseminate them and pass them out to all of you. So the top little section up there talks about what are some of the common symptoms or struggles. Now, I often will kind of break them up into three main groups. Depression affects people emotionally. Depression tends to affect people with their thinking, cognitively. And depression also tends to affect people with their behaviorally. So we have the emotional side of it, we have the thinking side of it, and then we have the behaving side of it, okay? And if you look at these symptoms, we have insomnia, we have hopelessness, we have fatigue, we have irritability. Irritability is probably the most common symptom of depression we see in adolescents, okay? We don't tend to see the sadness, the crying as much in teenagers. They kind of get really prickly, like a cactus, kind of irritable. Restlessness, we have diminished interest or pleasure in activities. There's a fancy word that psychologists use. It's called anhedonia. Has anybody ever heard of anhedonia before? If you break it down, it really makes sense. You know what the word hedon is all about? Hedon is a word that means pleasure. It's the root word of hedonism, okay? And so when people have depression, one of the core struggles that they have is what we call anhedonia. So when you put the prefix of a or an in front of a word, it usually means without. And so with depression, people who often struggle with this are without pleasure. They're just blah. If you would ask, pick a color to describe your mood, what do you think they would say? A lot of people would say gray. They would say kind of this, you look outside in the Wisconsin weather in winter, kind of just blah, okay? It's not always black. It's just this absence of joy, this absence of things that really are kind of exciting or joyful. Problems with concentration or thinking clearly. We have memory problems as well. Persistent sadness. Sleeping. Sometimes we see sleeping more. Sometimes we see people unable to sleep with insomnia. Feelings of guilt or worthlessness. Overeating or loss of appetite. And then in some really serious situations, we do see thoughts of suicide or even people making an attempt at suicide. Okay? Now, you can see that there are quite a few different symptoms up there of depression. In order to be diagnosed, you only have to have 5, okay? Now, I am not a math major. That's actually why I chose psychology. But if you only need 5 out of that entire list, what that should tell all of us is that one person's depression might look very differently than another person's depression, okay? And sometimes we see people struggle with, we call them a melancholic or a vegetative depression, where they're sleeping all the time, they're just sad, they have very little, if any, energy, they just kind of sit around and are a bump on the log because that's all they feel like doing, okay? They're very subdued, they're very sedate. On the other hand, we also see some people who have very agitated depression. They can't sleep, they feel like their stomach is going a million miles an hour, and they have a lot of almost anxiety symptoms with it. They both can be depressed, but they definitely have very different presentations, and they might look very differently, okay? And that's important for us to know as professionals of how we might help that person calm down or actually get more energized and more activated. There are lots of different kinds of depression. Probably the most common one that we see is major depressive disorder. We call it MDD. This is just what you and I probably think of as these people are depressed, okay? But there are other kind of circumstances and other patterns that we see with depression. We see postpartum depression, which is after a birth, typically. This is my professional opinion. I'm not saying you have to agree with me. But in my mind, this is a hormonal issue, and it really does need to be treated with medication. You can do counseling with a woman who has postpartum depression until you are blue in the face. And part of what they have gone through is just hormone, body, chemical changes. and medication is a very, very necessary and a very important part of helping women with postpartum depression. We see some people who struggle with chronic depression, and we call this persistent depressive disorder. And these are people who have really struggled with depression for at least 2 or more years. That's a long time. These are the folks that do tend to be fairly hopeless, okay? It's one thing to go through a really bad bout of depression, but then to have that last for years, you do begin to have a lot more hopelessness, helplessness, and just a lack of ability to believe that things could or would ever get better, okay? And then finally, one of my favorite acronyms out there for seasonal affective disorder, it's SAD, right? That is something that happens a lot here in Wisconsin. Right around this time of the year is when I see a lot of my folks start to struggle, okay? We start to see right around the time change, or maybe right at the end of October, beginning of November, there's less daylight, there's less sunshine, and people who are more susceptible to these seasonal fluctuations with sunlight, they do tend to struggle more. So basically, the further you are away from the equator, so it could be the further north, the more likely you are to have it, or even the further south, whenever it is your winter, the more likely you are to have seasonal affective disorder. And that's just that's a physical kind of response to our environment, okay? Now, what are some of the common causes of it? Truthfully, we know that biology and genetics is a factor, okay? About 30% to 40% of all the factors that cause depression are just inherited, okay? So you're just dealt a certain hand of cards, and you may be more or less vulnerable or susceptible to it, okay? Now, that doesn't mean you are guaranteed to get it, but we know that if you have a first-degree family member, if you have a mom or a dad, or maybe if you have an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent, the reality is you are at a higher risk for it, okay? And that is just one of the factors that we know is the result of living in a sinful world. We know that there can be some psychological factors. So people who have other mental health struggles, people have anxiety means they're more likely to have depression. Most people who come to our clinics, and this is nationwide too, most people have more than one struggle. It's not just they have pure depression or pure anxiety. There's a combination of numerous things that are all weighing on that person, okay? So we know that having histories of trauma, issues in the past or in the present of substance use issues, anxiety issues, just dealing with all kinds of stress at work, these things all increase the likelihood that somebody might struggle with depression. Environmental, what might be some kind of factors in your environment, factors in your world that may increase your chances of having depression? In the back, yeah. I'm sorry? Someone close to you dying, okay? I worked with a client recently, and maybe you guys even heard at St. Paul and Appleton, one of their teacher's assistants in their early childhood center had a brain aneurysm last week and passed away very suddenly. It's a big shock to that school, to those kiddos as well, but you think of the family, okay? So loss of a loved one, yeah.
Diagnosed with a terminal illness, which can't work, there's no money.
Yeah, absolutely. So being diagnosed with maybe a terminal illness or a serious illness, that in of itself, but then maybe having some issues where you're unable to work. There's financial stress. I think of a lot of things like people who have gone through divorce or marriage problems. If there's any abuse in the past or in the present. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen to us in our life that may or may not impact our moods, okay? Yeah. Living in a dysfunctional family. And there's all different kinds of factors that we could probably look at with that. But, yeah, I mean, I've heard many psychologists say we're all dysfunctional. It's just a matter of to what degree. And I think there's some truth in that, especially as we are sinful human beings, that we're all sinfully dysfunctional. It's just a matter of to what degree. And then I mentioned earlier just the whole genetic factor. That's just a factor that we do need to contend with here. So on any given day, there's about 7%, 6 to 7% of adults 18 or older who have had depression. This was back in 2014, I would imagine the rates are pretty similar, maybe, if anything, a bit more. Okay. A little bit higher in adolescents, those 12 to 17-year-olds. About 11%, between 11 and 12%, have had a major depressive episode in the past year. Women are twice as likely to have depression as men. What are some reasons of why we think that might be? And please don't say women are the weaker sex. Hormones could be one, okay.
Some of it to do with me too is women get the treatment.
Women get the treatment, yeah. I often cite this statistic when I talk about this. Men are twice as likely to struggle with a substance abuse problem. I think that's how many men try to self-medicate their problems away, whereas women are twice as likely to report issues but then actually go get help with these issues. I actually think that just societal kind of pressures and factors do affect men being maybe a little bit less likely to go get some help. Yeah. Being a mom, right? I'm married. I have 2 beautiful kids. My wife is amazing. I'm sure Trudy can attest to that. But the reality is, being a mom is hard. And even in families where there are 2 working adults, the research tells us moms still tend to do the majority of the work around the house. So it's a lot. It's a lot of stress. And we also know that there's a lot of issues that we see amongst service members, that's the most common struggle for many service members in the military. What do we do to help? We're going to talk more about some of these interventions, but I would say there are good treatments available. Some of them involve medication, but there's a lot of really good Christian counseling interventions that can offer hope and that can offer help even for people who are struggling with not just a short burst of depression, but even with a more chronic struggle with depression. This is my ABC model. I try to keep things simple, probably just as much for me as it is for you. And this is the ABC model that I often use to explain depression to a lot of my clients. This ABC model comes from an approach to helping people with counseling that we call CBT, which stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. Okay? The C part, the cognitive part, is your thinking. The B part is your behavioral part. What are you doing? And those were some of the things that I had talked about earlier, how we kind of look at symptoms of depression in 3 main groups: the emotional, the thinking, the cognitive, and then also the behavioral. So, the A up on top, I'm not sure, my click does work. That's feelings. A is for affect, that's a fancy word for feelings. Okay. The C down here in the bottom right is for cognitive or for your thinking. And then the B over here is for your behavior and what are you doing, and also just some physical factors. I do put the S in the center here because to me, no matter how we're feeling, no matter what we're thinking, or no matter what we're doing, our faith in our kind of spiritual life should really be central to all of that, okay? It should impact all of those things, so it's really core and central. But when we're trying to help people who are struggling, we actually don't tend to directly do anything to make them feel better. We try to actually help them think differently and then make different kinds of choices. Now, why is that? Because feelings are consequences, okay? Feelings don't just happen. They are a response, or they occur in response to something that happens to us in our life, okay? I often give this example. My brother-in-law owns a roofing company, and there was a few years ago, he was absolutely desperate for work. It was maybe one of the hailstorms came through the area, and when out of his desperation, he asked me to help out, okay? And we ended up roofing a house that was 1 story. It was a very, very flat roof. And I was terrified, okay? It was 4 points of contact on that roof at all times, okay? Now, my brother-in-law, who has been doing this for 20 years, is literally running up and down the ladder with a 75-pound bundle of shingles on one hand, maybe holding onto the ladder or running around, jumping from dormer to dormer, okay? This is the same roof, that Brandon is on versus Nate is on, okay? But he perceived that roof a lot less scary than I did because of his experiences. Now, I give this as an example because it just goes to show us that a situation isn't guaranteed to affect one person the same as another person. Our perceptions of that situation, our experiences with that situation are going to shape how we think and how we view that situation and how we feel, right? I was terrified, and my brother-in-law probably had no fear whatsoever in that situation, okay? So our thoughts and our perceptions are really, really huge when it comes to this. So when we're thinking about what factors cognitively, how do you think depression affects our thinking? What are some ways that it tends to change how we see things or maybe even how we think about the future? What do you guys think? What? Fogginess, indecisiveness, those are huge, okay? Yes, absolutely. We tend to be very pessimistic, very negative. I think people tend to think in a very hopeless way. Things are always going to be this bad, okay? Power of negative expectations is a big thing, okay? What are some ways that we tend to see people change their behavior? What are they doing when they are depressed? How does that affect things?
You know, one of two ways you can stop doing things.
Yeah.
Withdraw into yourself, or you start doing everything because you're into yourself out of it.
Yeah, so it can go both ways. I would say more often we tend to see the first, where people begin to shut down. Physically, they stop doing things that they used to do, that they used to enjoy. Socially, they tend to withdraw. They tend to isolate. Now, we know that God created us to be social beings, and so is that probably going to help us or hurt us if we socially withdraw from people? It's probably going to hurt us, right? And many times, physically, they just get less active. They sleep more, they sit around more. And again, we know movement, exercise, doing things that are healthy for us are a good thing for our mood, okay? And so definitely when people are more sedative or they're socially isolated and withdrawn, that's generally not a good thing, okay? I show this model too just to show how these all play in and affect one another. I think many people who I meet with will talk about depression, and then they will start to kind of notice how their thinking gets more negative, and it's, I stink, the world stinks, the future is going to stink, right? And now, if you're kind of looking at your world negatively or pessimistically, are you probably going to want to try things and take chances and do things, or are you just going to avoid doing them? You're going to avoid doing them. And now we've got people who are thinking more negatively, who are maybe struggling with this, and then who are doing less. And we go back up to the top of this, to the A, we tend to see people's depression get worse. And then we tend to see them think more hopelessly and negatively. They tend to do less and they isolate more, and then they tend to feel worse. It just tends to be a very, very vicious cycle here, okay? So we'll talk about some of the strategies of what to do are going to really intervene, changing people's thinking and also changing what they're doing, okay? So these are some mood management strategies. They may actually help with anxiety in addition to depression, but these are just good practical tools that do really help. And if you want some additional information on any of these, just send me an email. I think my email is on the handout that you guys got. If not, just stop up and talk to me afterwards too. So relaxation, the 4-4-8 breathing technique, pretty simple. You're going to breathe in for 4, you're going to hold your breath for 4, and then you're going to breathe out for 8, okay? And you're going to do that for a couple of minutes. Why is that? When people tend to get anxious or they tend to get more emotionally distressed, what tends to happen to their breathing? Does it slow down or does it speed up? It actually speeds up, okay? People who are hyperventilating, that's kind of an extreme case. But even very subtly, people's breathing tends to really ramp up the more distressed they get, okay? And so breathing in for 4, but then holding your breath for 4, it forces you to slow down how quickly you can breathe in and breathe out, okay? It gives a little more time maybe for that oxygen to saturate your lungs and eventually kind of get out to where it needs to in your body as well. And then you breathe out for an 8 count. That when people do tend to get anxious, they tend to overbreathe. They tend to breathe in emphasizing the in-breath and not the out-breath. And in a very kind of elementary scientific way, why do we breathe out? It's to get rid of the junk, okay? And so we really need to focus on trying to make sure we're getting rid of all that junk that is kind of accumulating. You may have heard of progressive muscle relaxation before. This is alternating between tensing muscle groups and then relaxing them, okay? Maybe you heard of, there was an ad a few years ago for, I think it was Cymbalta, which is a pretty common anti-depression medicine. And the tagline for their marketing slogan was, "Depression hurts." Okay? If you've ever had depression, many times people will say that it actually physically hurts, that your body aches, and that if you had chronic pain issues, it actually makes that pain worse. And there's truth in this, okay? Tensing your muscles for about 10 seconds and then relaxing them for 20 is a very effective way to actually reduce some of that muscle tension that is associated with the pain of depression. And it also helps calm the body down and relax the depression and the anxiety symptoms, okay? If you want more information on either the 448 or progressive muscle relaxation, again, just shoot me an email. I have handouts on both of those. One of the things that tends to happen is people, when they shut down, is they just stop doing things or they begin procrastinating. Now, when you procrastinate, does that actually make your problems go away? It doesn't. Did they actually hang around and maybe get worse? Absolutely. So this is one of those nasty little ways that depression and anxiety, it just feeds into itself. I had a doctor I'd worked with one time who told me, emotions love themselves. And I thought that was a quirky little thing to say, but the whole concept behind emotions loving themselves is that emotions change our thinking and our doing in such a way that it's going to make those feelings stronger. Okay? It kind of goes back to that ABC model. Procrastination and avoiding is one of those ways in which it just feeds into itself and makes the anxiety or it makes the depression worse. And so we talk about avoiding, that if you're going to avoid anything, avoid the avoiding. Okay? Now, it's kind of a quirky little thing to say, but it actually works very well. And so sometimes when I'm working with clients who have depression, I do Nike therapy. And we talk about you're just going to do it. And that you probably aren't going to feel like doing it if you're depressed. But just because you feel like it doesn't mean you're unable to do it. Now, we do sometimes break things down into smaller, more manageable chunks. But nonetheless, we got to get people reactivated if they're depressed. We got to get them more socially connected if they're depressed. We need to get them back in God's Word if they are depressed, okay? And so part of it is, maybe you're used to coming to church every single week, but maybe what we're going to have you do is actually read the Bible for 10 minutes a day, and then kind of build on that from next week to next week, okay? But we got to get people doing things again, kind of more activated. Self-soothing is another set of skills. I gave you guys a handout on this. The simple explanation for it is that we have 5 primary senses. We have vision, we have our hearing, we have our taste, touch, and smell. And for each of these 5 senses, they can be stimulated in a way that is either soothing or calming, or it can be very irritating or aggravating. Okay? And what works for me might be very different for you. There may be a certain smell that I really enjoy that is calming, but it might drive you nuts, okay? Or a certain music that I like may be very relaxing that may do just the opposite for you. So there's not a right and a wrong for this. It's sort of whatever works for you. It's very specific to you and very subjective. But the goal is to go through here and pick out 1 or 2 things that you can do for each of those 5 different senses that are soothing. And this can be very helpful for people both proactively, so before they're even depressed or before they're even anxious, to help them stay calm and kind of collected. It's also very good if they're noticing they're having more of the anxiety or the depression as a way just to kind of soothe and to calm and to relax, okay? A couple of the cognitive strategies, so this goes along with that ABC model again. The last set of slides kind of corresponded with the B part on the bottom of our triangle. Now we're over on the C part of that triangle on the bottom right of treating thoughts as guesses. That we're not going to get so stuck to our thinking that just because we thought it, it must mean that it is true. Okay? That a thought is just a thought. That just because you have a thought doesn't mean that it is the gospel truth. Okay? And so we're getting a little bit more, we call it diffused, or a little bit more separated from some of these thoughts. Because we know that this self-talk, I'm a loser, I'm not good for anything, I'm never going to amount to anything, that those can become very powerful expectations and very powerful tapes that play in people's mind. Okay? They might not be true, but if you keep saying them over and over and over again, they're going to become true. Okay? And so it's not getting so connected to the fact that just because you had a thought, it must be true. This next one is, again, maybe a quirky one. It's thanking your mind for having the thought. There's a well-known psychologist named Dr. Stephen Hayes. I'm not related to him, so I'm not like plugging things for a family member here. But he developed an approach to counseling. It's called ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. It's really good treatment. And one of his big things, too, was we need to get people less stuck together or less fused to their thinking. And that the fact is we all have thoughts that we can't control. Okay? How many of us have had a thought if we're driving over a bridge? I wonder what would happen if I just drove off the side of a bridge. Okay? I bet almost every single one of us has had some of those really kind of wild, shocking thoughts that just pop into our head. Okay? You don't have to announce them in front of the group here. You don't have to. It's not audience participation time. But the fact is, these are normal thoughts. These are things that we just don't have control over. Okay? But if we get stuck on some of those thoughts, then you're going to start to obsess, and they're going to have a much greater impact on your mood negatively. And so it's just no one has total control over their thoughts. So don't freak out when you experience some of these negative or these distressing thoughts. You kind of notice it. This is when we do Frozen therapy. We just let them go. And I will not try to sing Frozen. But we let these thoughts go. Because we all have these intrusive thoughts that we can't stop or always control. But we just notice them, let them go, and then we're going to refocus on what's the reality and what we know God says in His Word. Okay? And then also just trying to be realistic with our self-talk. That, again, seeing a situation for what it really is. Okay? I didn't watch this series a whole lot, although I have actually been introduced to it through many of my clients. I think you guys watched Dragnet back in the day. And what was Sergeant Joel Friday's big tagline? Stick to the facts, man, right? And that's really what we're trying to do here is, it's not what do you feel, it's not what do you think, but just the facts, man, right? And that's really what we're trying to ground our thinking in, is what is the evidence and what does God actually say in His Word in that situation. So it's realizing that our thoughts may, especially if we are struggling with depression or anxiety, they may not be accurate, but we can actually choose to reground and refocus on what is true and what is known to be true in God's Word. Okay? A couple of spiritual strategies. Again, I don't want to say this in any kind of a dismissive way of, well, just remind yourself of how blessed you are, okay? Because we all are very blessed. There is no doubt about that. The pastor of my church, I go to, Emmanuel in Greenville, he and his wife just got back last week. They adopted their son from Colombia. And it so happened that the day he got baptized last Saturday night, was also his birthday, and we were named godparents for their son, and so we were invited to the baptism and the birthday party. And their son, who was 10, had never had a birthday party before. He was completely overwhelmed by just the generosity and the gifts of people. Okay, and it was something that we take for granted. I mean, how many of us have ever not had a birthday, right? And how many of you have gone through a birthday and never gotten a gift, right? He had never had that before. Okay. And it was just reminding ourselves. One of our pastors at Emmanuel serves on a WELS board and did some work over in China. And he always talks about having black boogers. Okay? It's kind of a gory little introduction to a story, right? But the reality was he was over there, and the first day he got back to his hotel and was getting ready to go out to dinner and blew his nose, and what came out was just black. And he's like, oh, this is terrible. I'm getting sick. I'm in China. What am I going to do? This has got to be some nasty virus. Maybe I caught something on the airplane. And you know what he realized? That's just the air quality over there where he was staying in China. Now, how many of us have ever stopped and given thanks when we've taken a breath that we actually had clean air? Okay? That's something that we just so take for granted is just not always a guarantee around the world. And so, having a commitment to maybe keeping a gratitude journal of what are going to be maybe 2 or 3 things for which you are grateful and that you're going to write down each and every day. Okay? And make that very intentional. Not just waiting until you're depressed, but maybe even doing that proactively. Okay? What a great way just to keep ourselves focused on the way. And many times that we don't even realize that God blesses us. Pray often. Again, this is something where if you are depressed, you may need to do very, very intentionally. Okay? And then also try to find comfort and meaning in struggles. It's easy to say if you're not depressed, to say, oh, God's got a plan for you. But reminding yourselves that definitely God does have a plan and that he promises to work good in all things for those who love him. But there is a meaning for it. A couple of just general self-care things, which are both kind of preventative and also helpful for dealing with, is try to get adequate exercise. That usually means about 3 times a week. Research tells us that exercise is just as effective as antidepressant medication for mild and moderate depression. Okay? Because exercise is pretty much the exact opposite thing as what you would do if you're depressed. You're physically moving your body around. Okay? Trying to get adequate sleep and then making a conscious commitment to recreation and hobbies. Trying to be present in the moment of just kind of living one day at a time, kind of just focusing on now, not worrying so much about the future. And that if you do have worry, of actually setting aside some dedicated time just to worry. Now, that sounds totally counterintuitive, doesn't it? God tells us not to worry. Why is Dr. Hayes telling me to worry? Because this is a way that you keep track of all the things that you want to worry about during the course of your day, and then you dedicate 5 or 10 minutes to worrying about those things at the end of the day. What tends to happen for those people when they get to their worry time at the end of the day? All those things that they were worrying about aren't a big deal. Okay? And so it's a really great way to help gain better control over worry by, in a weird way, kind of paradoxically, setting aside time to actually do it. You find out that many of those things aren't a big deal anymore. There are some resources that are all included, both books from Northwestern Publishing House, and then also just some general ones as well, too. If you have any additional information for resources, I believe these are on there as well. There's some teen ones. There's a new teen text line that's very common for a lot of our clients who are teenagers. And just being aware of these symptoms, know that obviously there are good tools and techniques that can help. If there's anything else I can do to help, please stop up, talk to me afterwards. If not, thank you so much for your time, and God bless the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hayes, for being with us here again today, and to the rest of your staff, too, with the past few weeks. Really nothing more to add other than Pastor Keeler is out of town today, so if somebody was looking for him, he won't be here. If you're and I are around, if you need any questions on anything. And as soon as we do receive